All right, hello everybody. Welcome. We're going to get started now. So thank you so much to everyone here today, both in person and on Zoom. As you can see, we are live streaming this to folks on Zoom. We are also recording if anybody would like the recording afterwards. We have some refreshments in the back, so please help yourselves. We have the book for sale just outside the conference room, so please feel free to purchase a copy. You might even get it signed by the author. And we are so excited today to have Holger Droessler, Assistant Professor of History here at WPI, who's going to be talking about his new book, Colonialism, which just came out from Harvard University Press. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Paige, and for everybody involved organizing. Thanks for coming out on this spring day. Good to see colleagues and students here at WPI, and thanks for the opportunity to present on this book for around 40 minutes today. And welcome everybody also on the Zoom. We'll have time for questions afterwards. So yesterday I was thinking about starting the talk with a joke to capture, your goodwill. Because that's what you're supposed to. But then my 2-year-old son overheard me and said, no joke. So no joke it is. I do, however, want to begin my talk with an acknowledgement. My research would not have been possible without the tireless commitment by generations of Samoan scholars, archivists, and guardians of community knowledge to preserve the memory of their ancestors. As an outlander, I hope that my small contribution inspires more research on working people in Samoa and their links to the wider world. Whaftai telelava. All right, let's make these a little bit bigger, the slides. My book tells the story of Samoa's relations with the rest of the world from the closing decade of the 19th century until the end of World War I, through the eyes of working people. Thousands of workers, locals, and newcomers laid the foundation for Samoa's integration into the world. Independent Samoan producers who sold surplus copra to traders were essential to the prosperity of German and American Samoa. And I'll talk more about those two colonies in a minute. So were the thousands of Melanesian, Micronesian, and Chinese contract workers who picked and processed coconuts and cocoa, tapped rubber trees, and weeded plantation grounds. Workers also built the colonial infrastructure necessary to connect Samoa internally and with the rest of the world. As Samoa was drawn into the orbit of Euro-American empires at the turn of the 20th century, the island's working people extended their networks and interests outward into the wider Pacific and beyond. Even as they were coerced co-makers of colonial globality, workers in Samoa created their own way of relating to the world, which, inspired by Oceanian intellectual Ipili Hau'ofa, I call Oceanian globality. And that's one of the central concepts of my book. Confronted with coconut colonialism, the title, and I'll explain that more in a minute, Samoans and other islanders counterposed their own definition against the limiting form of globality that colonial officials and capitalists sought to force on them. In doing so, they filled the foreign and quite abstract notion of the global with their own culturally specific and relational meaning. Over the course of the 19th century, the makers of Oceanian globality struggled to extend their shared values of social reciprocity into the wider world. Crucially, the global connections, and we're doing a lot of global stuff here at WPI, that bound Samoa to Euro-American traders, planters, and politicians depended on the very local connections that Samoan, Melanesian, Micronesian, and Chinese workers made with one another.
Sorry to interrupt, we're having a little trouble with the Zoom slides.
Oh, okay.
Not showing up in full.
Can't see them. Maybe I should just go on a larger one again. Sorry about that.
No, sorry.
Is that better?
Oh, that's better.
Should I try again, or should I just stay on this one? Maybe.
It's up to you.
We'll stay on this one then.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Sorry about that.
Works now? You can see?
Yes,
Good.
Yes.
Here you can see better.
Technical difficulties.
In Indeed, most Samoans did not distinguish between the global and the local in any meaningful way because their far-reaching malanga, the Samoan word for travels, were designed to attend to interpersonal relationships all along. But even though Oceanian cosmopolitanism had deep roots, Samoans' travels at the turn of the 20th century, the period that I study in the book, from Sydney to Munich to San Francisco, were unprecedented. Through traveling and meeting fellow Pacific Islanders around the world, these globetrotting Samoans grew increasingly aware of shared struggles against colonial exploitation. Samoans realized their version of Oceanian globality in different ways, from projecting their malanga into the world to entering into a Polynesian confederacy with their Hawaiian and Tongan kin in 1887. Ultimately, as Samoans became more conscious of the global dimensions of colonialism, they began to challenge outlander rule over their islands more directly in the wake of World War I. Now here, finally, an image of Samoa, of Apia, the capital of independent state of Samoa today. That was one of my first research trips there in 2012. This is sort of the port and the promenade there at the port facility and some government buildings in the background, just to give you a sense of the environment and the place that we are talking about. Now, a little bit of context on Samoa, since this might not be so familiar to people in Worcester and whoever else is zooming in from around the world. The decades before and after 1900 formed an important transition period for Samoans and many other Pacific Islanders. As new means of communication and travel sought to shrink space and time, the turn of the 20th century brought profound economic, political, and social change to the Pacific. Samoa in 1889, that's when I start the book, and Samoa in 1919, at the end of the First World War, that's where I end, were quite different places. Here are three major transitions. First, the islands had lost their formal political independence as Great Britain, Germany, and the United States struggled over control. After 1900, the 40 miles of ocean separating the islands of Upolu in German Samoa and Tutuila in American Samoa became an international boundary. Initially, the border was weakly policed and easily crossed. Over time, however, it hardened into a substantial barrier that slowed down exchange between Samoans in the Western Islands and those in the East. As Samoans adjusted to formal colonial rule after 1900, the economic and political trajectories of German and American Samoa began to diverge, with far-reaching consequences for their political status and migration patterns, still today. Second major transition here at the turn of the century is that the patchy array of foreign-owned copra plantations in the 1880s experienced explosive growth in the following decades. As a result of this expanding plantation agriculture, Samoa became home to a diverse group of people from around the Pacific world. Besides the around 40,000 Samoans who lived on the islands, several thousand migrant workers came to work on Samoan plantations from other parts of the Pacific, particularly the Gilbert Islands, which is now part of Kiribati, in Micronesia around the equator, the Solomon Islands, and also New Guinea. Beginning in the early 20th century, they were joined by several thousand more from China. As a result, Samoan farming practices came under increasing pressure from a growing plantation economy dominated by foreign traders and worked by migrants from China and other Pacific islands. And third and finally, Samoa became increasingly entangled in shipping, communication, and entertainment networks that encircled the globe at the end of the 19th century. The expansion of copra plantations and regular shipping lines tied Samoa ever tighter to global trade networks. Workers built new hospitals, administration buildings, and a coaling station for the US Navy in Tutuila. Radio stations in American and German Samoa connected the islands to imperial metropoles, but also to warships. And they offered easier access to news. For their part, Samoan performers in ethnographic shows used the new infrastructure to travel to distant places, becoming cultural ambassadors in the process. And the new languages of the colonizers created new forms of employment for Samoans who became interpreters and clerks. Uncovering the aspirations of workers on plantations, on show stages, and in governors' offices reveals a social world beyond the control of colonial officials and too often beyond the purview of historians. So this is a bit of an overview. Here are some maps. They're also part of the book to kind of situate you. A Pacific-centered map, which is always great to see, since most of the maps we see here are kind of, Americas or, Europe, Atlantic focused. This is a Pacific-centered, roughly Pacific-centered world map showing you the major places that play a role in my book. And then we have a zoom in, kind of an inlet for the Samoan Islands themselves. So I mentioned the two major islands in the west, Savaii and Upolu, here, that became part of German Samoa in the late 19th century and are now independent Samoa, Western Samoa. And then in the east, you have a smaller island, Tutuila, with Pangu Pangu, the kind of capital and major port, which is the major island of American Samoa, together with the Manua Islands in the east. And that is still in US unincorporated territory today. Now, long before the European Age of Empire, Samoa had been at the crossroads of people on the move. Located around halfway between Hawaii and Australia, Samoa emerged as one of the cultural centers of Oceanian life. Genealogy, trade, and occasional war linked Samoans with fellow islanders, particularly those in Fiji to the southwest and Tonga to the south, and as far away as the Marquesas Islands in the eastern Pacific. Austronesian voyagers from the Western Pacific had first settled on this group of volcanic islands as they expanded a shared oceanic culture known as the Lapita. Likely the direct ancestors of most Polynesians today, the Lapita people were highly mobile seaborne explorers who, starting around 1500 BCE, spread from northern New Guinea across eastern Melanesia into central Polynesia, including Samoa. Archaeologists who found shards of Lapita pottery, that's the name, where the name comes from, in the Mulifanua Lagoon in northern Upolu in Samoa in the late 1960s, date the earliest human presence in Samoa to around 800 BC. And sort of for comparison, that's a bit before Homer wrote the Odyssey, an epic about migration set in the sea closer to Germany. Over 3 millennia, then, Samoans had come to share collective identity, Samoa Uma, which would shape their encounter with foreign newcomers in the 19th century. Like other islanders, Samoans sustained their oceanic culture through travel and movement. According to Fa'a Samoa, the Samoan way of life, Samoans demonstrate kinship by traveling to see relatives for important life events and conduct diplomacy, by consulting with allies in times of crisis. Samoans call these traveling parties malanga. That's a term that I used before already, which also refers to travel more broadly and also movement and even mobility. So malanga is one of the central concepts here in my book as well. More than simple travel, malanga are crucial to maintaining VA, the links, pathways, and networks that people reestablish as they move. As the central principle of the Samoan moral economy, Va denotes spaces in between people, like the one we're just having here, and then virtually into the Zoom, between places and environments that need to be in balance and reciprocal. By moving back and forth between these relational spaces, Samoans nurture social harmony and ensure the integrity of their culture. Throughout the 19th century, the popularity of malanga increased as new people, places, and objects were incorporated into the practice. After 1899, colonial and Samoan governments alike were quite concerned with restricting and regulating malanga, for as much as any Samoan practice, malanga troubled colonial intentions of controlling and disciplining Samoans and Samoan politics. And that's true, of course, in other colonial settings as well. People on the move, crossing borders, are usually a concern for colonial officials. Yet Samoans would not be easily contained. By the close of the 19th century, colonial boundaries around space, race, and political sovereignty threatened Samoan traditions of mobility and cultural exchange. As colonial boundary makers introduced new spaces that separated people, Samoans continued to spin their own webs of social, economic, and environmental relationships. Wherever they went, Samoans sought to reconstitute existential relational spaces threatened by the forces of colonialism. To understand this rewiring of Samoa in the context of unprecedented global interest in the islands at the end of the 19th century, it's essential to follow the workers who were busy updating old wires and laying new ones, quite literally in the sense with the telegraph cable. Building on their long-grown practices of mobility, Samoans extended Malanga from their villages and islands to the wider Pacific and even beyond. In doing so, Samoans enlarged their life worlds, even as colonial officials sought to narrow their paths and visions. The 19th century brought fundamental changes to the culture of mobility that Samoans had created over generations. As Europeans and Americans scrambled for the Pacific as one of the last colonial frontiers, scores of outlanders visited and settled on Pacific islands such as Samoa. By the 1850s, Samoa had become the target of coconut colonialism. And I define coconut colonialism as the extension of initially informal and subsequently formal Euro-American control over tropical islands to extract their resources, such as coconuts. So it's a subform of extractive colonialism you also see in other plantation colonies stretching around the globe. In 1857, so in the mid-19th century, the Hamburg-based trading house J.C. Godefroy and Sohn established its specific headquarters in Apia on Upolo's northern coast. So back here to that map, Upolo in Apia, the sort of commercial center that emerges in the mid-19th century. It was already an important settlement before, but with European and American interest in trade, it grows and is still today the capital. And the German sort of trade company connection also explains that I, as a German-born US historian, got interested in the topic in the first place. Happy to talk more about that later. Within years, Godefroy and Sohn expanded its trade in tropical fruit, especially coconuts, copra, and cocoa from Samoa to New Guinea and the Marshall Islands. Shipped to San Francisco and Hamburg, copra, the dried endosperm or meat of the coconut, was processed into vegetable oil, margarine, and soap. Can even use for explosives because there's some glycerin in them. So there were coconut bombs in the First World War, but usually used for oil, margarine, and soap. So quite important ingredients and even lubricants of industrial capitalism at the time. At the same time, British and American merchants opened the first trading stores, turning Apia into a bustling commercial center for trans-Pacific trade. In the 1860s now, Godefroy und Sohn and its successor company, the Deutsche Handels- und Plantagengesellschaft der Südseeinseln zu Hamburg, short DHPG. No one spelled that ever out at the time, so it's just short the German firm, or DHPG, began to purchase land from Samoans around Apia and along the northwestern coast of Upolo. So around Apia, that's kind of the plantation district, and then further stretching into the northwestern part to a port facility that connected Upolo with Savaii. In return, Samoan title holders, the Matai, received foreign goods such as metalwares and rifles, which they used to expand their political influence over rivals. So we have a land for arms sale that's also happening in other parts of the world at the time before. So throughout the 1870s, a vicious cycle of selling land for arms destabilized the economic and political systems of Samoa. In a series of violent clashes, German, British, and American officials and settlers allied with different Samoan parties competing for royal titles and political power. Outlanders consistently misunderstood Samoan politics, which was based on local and genealogical sources of authority. 2 decades of proxy wars, international treaties, and hundreds of casualties finally came to an end in 1899, when the islands were divided between Germany and the United States, while Great Britain would also interest there gained exclusive rights elsewhere. So that's a short story of the decades of civil war. In 1900, then, the 2 biggest Western islands, Upolo and Savaii, became officially part of German Samoa. And under Governor Wilhelm Solf's first administration, he was the first governor, Samoan cultural practices were more or less tolerated, while German officials stepped up their control over political matters through a flurry of regulations. Meanwhile, the US Navy in the east took control over the major island Tutuila in 1900, along with the smaller Manua Islands in 1904, just a little bit later. As a coaling station run by a small group of naval governors, American Samoa entered into a historical trajectory connected to, yet distinct from, Western Samoa. Outlanders had succeeded in dividing Samoan's long-drawn unitary system of decentralized power into 2 separate colonies. Most importantly, for political self-determination, Samoans had suddenly lost their ability to play off one colonial power against another. When World War reached the shores of Samoa in August 1914, German authorities did not put up a fight against the overwhelming show of force by Marines from Great Britain and New Zealand. This is actually one of the first acts of the First World War in distant Samoa. New Zealand occupied German Samoa during the war and took over the islands under a League of Nations mandate into the 1920s and beyond. Now, in the fall of 1918, the flu pandemic that trailed the millions of casualties of the World War hit Samoa especially hard, killing 1 out of 5 Samoans in New Zealand-controlled Western Samoa within months. Western Samoa is one of the hardest hit territories, places in the world during the Spanish flu. By contrast, nobody died in the neighboring US territory. And I've written elsewhere about why that probably was the case. Many in Western Samoa blamed the staggering human toll on the botched response by New Zealand administrators and called for greater self-determination. By the mid-1920s, the so-called Mao movement began to challenge colonial administrations head-on through international lobbying, public demonstrations, and economic boycotts. And part of the argument of my book is that sort of the backstory to this is actually the workers at the turn of the 20th century for this international anti-colonial organizing. Now, Western Samoa would gain its formal independence in 1962, the first colonized Pacific island to do so. I'm very proud of that. American Samoa, by contrast, remains an unincorporated territory of the United States to this day, a colony and all that. All right, so this is a bit of an overview. Here are the main arguments that I put forth in my book. Coconut colonialism is a history from way below and far away, but it's also a history from close up. It traces the struggles of workers in Samoa from the plantation grounds up and across thousands of miles of land and sea while staying firmly anchored in the South Pacific. For both islanders and outlanders at the turn of the 20th century, Samoa was not a footnote to world history, as the famous Scottish writer Robert Louis Stevenson wrote, and he died in Samoa, but to the contrary, at the very center of events. So Samoa is not just a footnote, but actually quite at the center, as I'm trying to argue with the book. Samoa's global importance in the age of empire deserves renewed attention from historians of globalization, colonialism, and capitalism. And I'll sketch out a little bit the contributions to these fields of scholarship. Now, histories of modern capitalism and globalization are typically set in Europe or its settler colonies, like this one, or more recently in China. But Pacific Islands in general, and Samoa in particular, are ideal places to rethink the history of colonialism and the colonial roots of globalization. During the European Age of Empire, the Samoan Islands emerged as objects of imperial competition over access to tropical cash crops, shipping lines, and coaling stations in the South Pacific. So Germans, British, and Americans were all interested in the Samoan Islands for those various reasons. Given these Euro-American claims on Samoa, the general terms of its integration into global circuits of trade, migration, and information were often beyond the direct control of workers on the islands. They often just built that infrastructure and only sometimes were actually able to use it. What set colonial Samoa apart from other plantation colonies at the time, however, was the fact that Samoans were able to protect a communal land base on which they continued sustainable farming. With their own food supply secured, Samoan farmers sold their surplus production of copra to foreign merchants in German Samoa and even the US Navy and American Samoa. So quite interesting story there. The US Naval Administration actually becomes kind of the middleman and organizes the sale of copra to world markets. As a result, Samoans exercised considerable power in shaping their relationship with the rest of the world. So that's one of the reasons I think it's interesting to study Samoan history at that time. The globalization of Samoa at the turn of the 20th century also adds a new chapter to the history of modern capitalism. First of all, workers were prominent actors in the dramatic expansion of capitalism to Samoa and to the Pacific more broadly. In the eyes of plantation owners and colonial officials at the time, and I've sort of found that out in the archive, the labor questions was really central to colonialism. This is not a new insight, but it's a reminder that actually studying colonialism through working people is quite productive. In Samoa and elsewhere in the Pacific, unfreedom and coercion survived the legal abolition of Atlantic slavery as different post-emancipation labor regimes came to coexist. Euro-American capitalists introduced wage labor on large plantations, putting pressure on independent Samoan farmers to sell their surplus crops for export, often under coercive conditions. At the same time, foreign-owned plantations attracted migrant workers from neighboring Pacific islands as far away as New Guinea and Kiribati. Faced with widespread Samoan resistance to land enclosure and wage labor, so most Samoans actually didn't enter into these wage labor contracts. They try to stay away from them. Plantation owners resorted to recruiting more and more contract laborers from elsewhere, including thousands from China in 1903. Samoan islanders and this diverse group of newcomers engaged in various forms of manual and intellectual labor. In their own ways, all of them were involved in shaping Samoa's relationship with the wider world. Asking big questions in a small place, the case of Samoa shows that historians need to focus on worker struggles and do so from a global perspective. Second, the experience of workers in colonial Samoa was typical of the past and arguably the present of work under capitalism more generally. The expansion of cash crop agriculture around coconuts posed particular challenges to Samoan farmers, as well as to the thousands of contract workers who came to the islands. Conflicts arose over difficult work conditions, greedy Euro-American agents, and the role of colonial administrations in the copra economy. If tropical fruits like the coconut were important drivers of colonization in Samoa and in the wider Pacific, they also shaped the contours of resistance to global capitalism. Because Samoan producers were successful in defending much of their land base from outlanders, they were able to maintain food sovereignty, the foundation for sustained military and political power. In this regard, Samoans had quite different experiences under Euro-American colonialism than did, for example, Hawaiians. Besides holding onto their land base for sustainable farming, Samoans creatively adapted the world of export copra to their own needs and values. Although short-lived, copra cooperatives in both German and American Samoa posed challenges to the economic hegemony of outlanders and questioned the very legitimacy of colonial rule over the islands. By launching copra cooperatives, Samoans proved themselves savvy participants in the global copra trade. And third, the Pacific also deserves more scholarly attention as one of the major post-emancipation commodity frontier zones. That's quite a mouthful. Commodity frontier zones. That means a site where new commodities are being extracted from natural resources, minerals to commodities, food crops that can be turned into commodities and sold on world markets. These commodity frontier zones are characterized by globally traded cash crops and oftentimes unfree labor migration. Beginning in the mid-19th century, Samoa became part of a plantation belt that spanned the subtropics from the Caribbean to Africa and to the South Pacific. This subtropical plantation complex was dominated by export-oriented monocrop production with varying degrees of mechanization and industrialization. Indeed, plantation labor in subtropical colonies helped fuel industrial capitalism in the metropoles. The advancing commodification of the global countryside was enabled by the building of crucial pieces of infrastructure. Very much topic here in this country over recent months, linking plantation islands such as Samoa to metropolitan markets. Hundreds of workers who built the roads, docks, and port facilities of Samoa made the circulation of commodities, ships, and migrants possible in the first place. While new shipping links enabled new kinds of global travel, colonial administrators used long-distance steamships for gunboat diplomacy and exiling uncooperative islanders. Plantations also brought together different labor regimes, ranging from indigenous producers and day laborers to small Euro-American settlers and large trading companies to migrant contract workers from around the Pacific. As historians of agricultural capitalism have argued, the confluence of different systems of labor, of unfree labor, enabled global cash crop markets to flourish. With its multiracial migrant labor force often divided against itself and subject to increasingly strict discipline, the subtropical plantation complex carried the seeds of today's global division of labor. Then as now, consumers of tropical fruit like coconuts in markets in the global north, and there's rarely a supermarket around here where you can find coconut products today. Consumers remain far removed from the conditions of production in the global south. Focusing on copra plantation workers in colonial Samoa reveals the hidden human costs of capitalist agriculture. And finally, the story of Samoa's relationship with the world offers a fresh take on the history of globalization. The conventional narrative about globalization emphasizes the role of the powerful in shaping the inevitable economic integration of our planet. Explorers sailed the ocean blue, colonial officials established law and order, and trade soon followed the flag. In contrast to this triumphalist account of globalization, this account of Samoa at the turn of the 20th century presents a more complicated picture. Globalization, as seen from the South Pacific at least, was a decidedly local and remarkably intimate affair that pitted Pacific Islanders against outlanders, workers against capitalists, and even fathers against their sons. Many of the central features of Samoa's globalization at the start of the 20th century are familiar to readers at the dawn of the 21st. Cash crop production and its attendant ecological costs, unfree forms of migration and plantation labor, and the resilience of ordinary people in the face of colonialism and capitalism. As I argue in the book, working people, diverse, mobile, and politically astute, were powerful participants in the struggle over the globalization of Samoa. By telling the stories of Samoans on the move, this book presents a neglected history of our global yet tenaciously unequal present. Given ongoing debates about the costs and benefits of globalization today, historians may do well to recall its contested character as well as deep colonial roots. All right, here's some of the central concepts that I already mentioned. The title, Oceanian Globality, as one of the central concepts, by which I mean a definition of relating to the world. Globality is kind of sort of a more academic term, but an understanding of being in the world, relating to other people in the world, that is based on local and quite big trans-Pacific Oceanian values. And here's some reciprocity, respect, travel. Malanga, the Samoan term for visiting parties, diplomatic missions, travel, mobility more generally, and va, with a long A, space between people and places. Now let's get to the book itself, a bit of an outline over the chapters, and then I'll dive into give you some examples of what I've actually been written about, the people that I trace at the time. So the book is structured in kind of topologically, place and theme, in 5 different workscapes. Each chapter captures a global process within the local context of Samoa. Chapter 1 is about the commodification of the Samoan economy. Chapter 2 about unfree labor migration. Chapter 3, the performative labor involved in ethnographic shows. Chapter 4 on the construction and transportation of communication lines, and the last chapter is about careers in the colonial service. Now, chapter 1 opens with the tropical fruit that sparked outside interest in the Samoan Islands in the 19th century, the coconut. Chapter 2, I look at plantation workers. In chapter 3, the ethnographic shows, infrastructure, and then colonial service. I'll jump into 3 of those underlined in the remainder of my talk. First, on the planters. Here you can actually see that process taking place, the drying of the meat of the coconut after being husked. Let me actually show you the first one before that, which is also the title of the book. This is a group of Chinese workers in the early 20th century. It's not dated, so it's, has to be after 1903 when the first Chinese workers actually arrived in Samoa, cutting copra. And you see kind of the mountains of husked shells in the background, dwarfing the workers who are doing that quite arduous task, also quite smelly. It's quite an intense process that had to be done mostly by hand. That's why you needed thousands of workers actually doing that work. Most of the planters themselves remain Samoans. So most of the production came from Samoans. Even though these contract workers came, as I mentioned, Samoans actually produced most of the copra and then sold it on. So that's an important aspect of the story. And here, that picture showing you the drying of copra, usually in the sun. So traditionally, Samoans, other Pacific Islanders, wherever else coconuts grow, use the sun to dry the endosperm of the coconut. Took a few days. If it didn't rain, you had to sort of pack up quick and move it undercover into one of the fales, one of the houses right there with the baskets. Euro-American planters were growing impatient and introduced incipient forms of mechanization, like a copra kiln, to dry this copra faster in order to export it. Dried copra has the advantage that it's lighter and then can be reheated in the destination markets to turn into oil, margarine. So that was a kind of innovation of trade as well. And in the chapter, I write about various workers on these plantations, how they related to one another. They attended church services, they learned new languages, they developed a new language, Samoan plantation pidgin. They interacted, they intermarried, and sometimes actually also banded together to strike against harsh working conditions. So that's what that chapter is about. Then chapter 3 is about performers. And this is a more sort of unorthodox, I think, form of labor. But I make the case that the performative cultural labor involved in Samoans who participated in ethnographic shows in North America as well as in Europe at the turn of the century actually usefully thought of in conjunction with other forms of work that we more traditionally associate, like plantation labor. Here's a picture of the Samoan village on the Midway at the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, probably one of the most famous World's Fairs, at least in the United States. This is just south of present-day University of Chicago campus, the Midway Plaisance. And Samoans were part of that. They had already come to the United States before that, but this was kind of a larger group. And they rebuilt, actually with material from Samoa, this Samoan sort of traditional fale, this kind of meeting house, and performed, at least in the eyes of metropolitan consumers, the US audiences who came to Chicago to see that, authentic Samoan culture. And I write about the kind of contradictions of this process. And interestingly, I think the performers faced similar issues than plantation workers. There were debates about pay, about the wages that they received, about mobility. The contracts were quite strict and didn't allow Samoan performers to actually travel beyond the individual cities where they were to perform. But they, by and large, didn't care and moved to other places, fell in love with some of the spectators. So there's some wild stories that happened in these settings. Other scholars who work on ethnographic shows, World's Fairs, have focused on other groups. This is sort of the first more substantial engagement with the Samoan part of this story in conjunction with other forms of labor. Here's another picture showing you also the exoticization and erotization of this form of performative labor. This is a almost exclusively female troupe of Samoans who traveled to Germany a little bit later in 1910 and performed in a zoo, in the Hagenbeck Zoo in Hamburg, famous zoo. Hagenbeck was also at the World's Columbian Exposition, actually in 1893, traveled sort of around the world to World's Fairs as well. But this time the Samoans came actually to the zoo and performed next to animals in that zoo. What I'm trying to argue beyond sort of the colonial gaze and the exploitation that came with these kinds of performances that many scholars have written about, I try to make the case also that Samoans actually over time adapted this form of travel to their own purposes and turned them into malanga, into a diplomatic mission that they had already done on their islands for quite a long time. So in fact, actually, Samoans were able to meet with political representatives during those trips. In that trip, actually, one of the male leaders actually met with Wilhelm II, the German emperor. So that's not, of course, visible on this picture, and there's no photograph, unfortunately. It would be nice to see that. But there was an encounter, diplomatic encounter, sort of, pleasantries were exchanged, and the etiquette was followed, and actually quite compatible, it turned out, German imperial and Samoan diplomatic etiquette. So not to take away, of course, from the exploitation that happened as well, but over time, I'm arguing that the Samoan performers also reinterpreted this paternalist exploitative logic to their own values. So Samoan performers, I say, created their own version of Oceanian globality by redefining their tours as cultural and diplomatic missions. And then finally, in the last chapter, the 5th chapter, I write about colonial service jobs that emerged in the wake of colonization. Soldiers, policemen, interpreters, clerks, and nurses, like Grace Pepe, shown here. There's a famous Samoan proverb that the pathway to leadership is through service. Samoan Matai, the title holders, were expected to serve their family, village, and country by providing resources, honoring the family name, fundraising for building projects, and giving skillful speeches. And I'm arguing that some of the Samoan service workers who joined the colonial administration also connected this long-standing value in the Samoan moral economy and sort of social relations, and understood their work as a form of service. Service to the colonial administration, to be sure, but also an opportunity for some Samoan service workers actually to learn new skills, make new connections, and also help Samoans heal the wounds of coconut colonialism. So Grace Pepe, that's one of the figures I write about there. This is a picture taken by the Navy. I just, got it then through eBay. This is on her trip on a ship, on a US Navy ship to San Francisco, Mare Island. This is kind of the naval yard of San Francisco for training. And she stayed there almost a year and received training in San Francisco in kind of Western American medicine. Pepe herself was already a Samoan traditional fofo, a healer, and connected, kind of sort of adapted, mixed in a bricolage, this sort of, Samoan ways of healing with newly gained Western American medicine. And she returned to Samoa, traveled to villages, and kind of spread that knowledge throughout the rest of her life. And lastly, and quite interestingly, I think Pepe also and many other service workers would emerge as anti-colonial leaders in the 1920s, partly because of those travels, because of their kind of intercultural, interlanguage skills that they had acquired, their closeness to colonial power. That's true also in other settings, and it's true in Samoa as well. So Grace Pepe became active in women's committees that then fueled the MAO, the anti-colonial movement in the 1920s. That's kind of where I end the book. All right. If you're interested in Samoa, then my book will give you a better sense of the contributions of working people to Samoan history, especially in challenging and eventually overcoming colonialism. So I hope people are now interested a little bit more in Samoa and Samoan history. This would be a good place to start. I would say there's other books, of course. This is sort of one of the more recent ones, actually. There's not a book on Samoa every year. Second, if you're interested in labor and capitalism, then my book will tell you about the role that coconuts played in modern capitalism and how untold numbers of unfree workers helped in the process. And third, if you're interested in globalization, and who isn't, then my book will remind you of the colonial roots of our interconnected world, but also of the ways in which islanders shaped their own place within it. And with that, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions. Paige is monitoring the chat. And then in the yeah, Constance.
As part of colonial infrastructure, is that how that happens?
Right. Yeah, so the telegraph with cable arrives in the 19-teens. So just a few years after, the British kind of connect with their all red sort of cable, all red line, all of their kind of major colonies. So it's in connection with that attempt by the British. And then the Germans and Americans, kind of latecomers to the imperial sort of infrastructure game, trying to catch up and build their own cable and independent communications infrastructure.
Yeah, interesting that was such an important part of the British colonial experience.
Right. Yeah, very important sort of, to increase the speed of information back and forth. And that plays out also in Samoa, sort of on a smaller scale, nothing compared to British India, but much smaller. And what's interesting in Samoa, and German Samoa in particular, but also in American Samoa, is then because this cable, kind of the physical, cable that, the internet still basically relies on, with optic fiber cables today, and many of the cables run on the same kind of, routes than these original ones, is almost immediately replaced by wireless technology, the newer, technology in town. And the Germans in particular invest a lot in wireless radio because they see a kind of Anglo-American, even more Anglo dominance in these cables, and in particular in gutta percha, which is this, organic rubber material that only grows in British Malaysia, basically, that is needed to insulate those cables and make them actually work. So that has a kind of material sort of bottleneck reason for that. And then there's a wireless station that also opens just before the First World War. So it's not really in operation for long. One of the first news that this wireless station receives is war has broken out in Europe. And then the New Zealanders and British that I mentioned, they come and, take over that radio station. And the US also has a radio station connecting its Pacific territories, Guam, Hawaii, the Philippines. Does that, sorry.
Oh, sorry, can you repeat the questions as they're asking?
Okay. Right, yeah, so the question was about telegraphs and cables. Yeah, sorry, that's good. So the Zoom can hear it as well. Does that address the question? Happy to talk.
But, it's harder to do across
Right, yeah, and the British they're from Fiji via Fanning Islands to Vancouver. That's sort of their trans-Pacific cable. And then across the Atlantic, they already existed by the mid-19th century. Happy to chat more about that. Lisa?
Since you also already offered, would you be able to speak a bit more about how you came to this project, especially as a historian who hails from Germany? To say a little bit more about the American-German transnational histories of Colonial?
Sure. So the question is about how I came to write a book about Samoa, coming from Germany and being a historian of the United States, in the United States, of all places. Yeah. So I'm representative of a past colonial power and a present day colonial power in Samoa. And I'm quite aware, and I'm being made aware of that fact whenever I talk to Samoan historians about that particular history. As I mentioned, my acknowledgement, as well as in the way I try to balance the various archives, I'm trying to build bridges with longstanding Samoan preservation of memories, as well as academic history with other fields of scholarship. So I see my book kind of participating in that, trying to build the bridge, make people interested in Samoa, but also offering Samoans and Samoan historians a kind of more global perspective on Samoa itself, which has been done, but not in a while. How I got to that is quite interesting. I think I studied American history in Germany, and one of my professors in Munich, and he's also got a shout out in the acknowledgements. He had a kind of lecture on U.S. foreign relations, which I teach now at WPI, more or less, like a similar kind of topic, and he mentioned Samoa in that context. And I got interested in thinking about connections between Germany and the United States. And then for some reason, I kind of remembered that. Hey, there was this talk about Samoa. So I got interested in Samoan history then and started exploring. And one research paper led to more, a dissertation. And this is the nucleus of that book. In many ways, I'm privileged because I have access, to the languages of the colonizers. My Samoan is quite basic. That's kind of a bit of a challenge of the book. Most of the archival research is in other records is in German and English, with some Samoan in there. much more needs to be written. Much more needs to be written about that particular story as well. This is just the beginning. Thanks for the question.
We have a couple questions.
Sure.
In the chat.
Yeah.
I might take a chat question and then just in-person question and maybe alternate. If that's okay.
Sure, I have to teach it once, so
Oh,
I mean, I'll catch up.
We can do it also outside.
all right. So first question in the chat: can you speak to some of the continuities between Samoan traditions of global activism and resistance and Samoan climate activism today?
By John. Thanks, John, for the question. Yeah, that's a big question. It's a bit outside of my time frame. You know, that's my cop-out answer. Climate change has already, begun in my time frame, of course. Right? It's a long history, but in some ways, one could say, as I mentioned, that the copra and coconuts fueled industrial capitalism in metropoles. It's not as big as, say, sugar or cotton. It's not such a big commodity in that sense, but it does contribute to an emergence of a consumer market in the metropolitan kind of global north. And in that way, it's a fuel of industrial sort of fossil fuel based capitalism, and hence also the climate crisis. Samoans themselves, living on volcanic islands, are very much at the forefront of rising sea levels, more intense cyclones, and other so-called natural disasters. And you rightly sort of, imply that in your question, are also at the forefront of, doing something about it. So they're quite active in the Pacific and then also in international fora to raise those issues and talk about Samoan, or more generally Oceanian Pacific Islander ways of dealing with environmental challenges. So I think one could make, even though I don't explore that, a connection between some of the anti-colonial activism from the working people, and then in the 1920s to present day climate change activism. That's not really a topic sort of in my period. No one's talking about climate change, but some of the structures and networks and also the institutional capacity is being built at that time that was then repurposed for other issues. Thanks for that question.
Great. Well, first, congratulations. This was a fascinating talk. The subject was really interesting. Not something I knew much about, so thanks for the little glimpse into it, but really well presented. Well done. I'm going to do the typical thing for the presenter. You're like, what does this have to do with the thing I'm interested in? So my question,
Shakespeare.
I was interested to think about performance as labor, which it is. And so I had a couple of questions, and this might be a longer conversation, so I'm going to engage you more about this.
Sure.
One, who was profiting from this performance labor?
Right.
Who was bringing, I know the history of the World's Fair, but who was bringing the Samoans in, who was profiting by this? But also, have you done any research, or have you learned anything about audience perception? So what did people who saw these performances think, and what was the impact of this kind of performative ethnographic culture?
Right. Great questions. Briefly, cui bono, so who benefited? A lot of managers, impresarios, who sort of, skimmed off, sometimes just left with the wages that were promised to the performers. One of the first tours were quite traumatic. Half of the ethnographic show troupe died along those tours in the 1880s, and that sort of set kind of the sort of tragic beginning, and scared a lot of other Samoans then to join subsequent troops. But then eventually they did, offered more money and sort of more self-determination also on the trip. So oftentimes it's managers who are doing all kinds of other management things in the entertainment sector. And the colonial administrations themselves also benefit kind of ideologically by presenting colonial subjects in to metropolitan audiences, presenting them as sort of pliant and content with, in this case, German colonial rule. That's part of the political project of bringing them also. And it's quite contentious also for other German colonies. companies. Can go into more detail about that. So that's kind of who benefits. Money-wise, the managers, symbolically, ideologically, the administrations in particular. And then audience, difficult. As with many cultural production audience studies, how do we know what people actually really thought? We have some intriguing photographs, I don't have it with me in the slides, of white, probably American women, sort of, in Victorian dress, ogling some of those, bare-chested Samoan men who were part of this troop in 1893. And we can only guess, what they were thinking. I talked about the, exoticization and erotization of those encounters. There's also an argument that scholars make that this, increases intercultural sort of, understanding in some way. To a degree, but it's very difficult to sort of measure that. What I'm more interested in is the Samoans themselves. So I didn't really pay that much attention to what the Chicago World Fair goers were thinking. I did mention some fell in love with them and they ran away in Germany. That happened, and in the US as well. Other final point maybe is that Samoans also befriended Hawaiians, who were also part of the Midway Plaisance. And as they returned, some Hawaiians actually came to Samoa to visit. So they apparently made quite good friends on the Midway Plaisance. Became kind of a middle ground of Polynesian interaction as well. So I try to trace that a little bit more than sort of what the Americans were thinking about all of that. But great questions, happy to talk more.
Really fascinating. I'm going to dash my 1 o'clock class, but stay long. Really nice, thank you.
Sure, thanks for coming. Maybe time for 1 or 2 more. Huh?
Yeah, we've got one in chat, and I think one more from here.
Great.
So one from Ulrike. Can you talk more about the, I don't know if I can pronounce this, the
Beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you. So the German company, how long were they active in Samoa? What were the reasons to pull out of these islands, and what were their methods of exploiting the islands?
Okay. Hi, Ulrike. Thanks for joining from Germany, probably. Yeah, so it's a question about the German firm Godefroy, which is sort of private Hamburg-based trading company, and how they established themselves. I mentioned that briefly. There's much more to say about that. Apia became kind of important in their kind of trans-Pacific trades. So the trading company also had trading stations in Jaluit in the Marshall Islands and in New Guinea. And then further, across the Pacific. So Samoa became a good kind of way station to kind of stop and resupply. That's often the case also, with other port cities in the Pacific and elsewhere. So that's one of the reasons Apia became important. They did mostly trade, but also then moved into land acquisition. First cotton, actually, during the American Civil War, there was a cotton famine, right? The Confederacy was blockaded, so that led to all kinds of cotton projects around the world, British Egypt, British India, other places, and on a very small scale also in Samoa, but it's the origins of land sales. And then they moved into other products because cotton didn't really grow that well in Samoa, and there's not enough sort of flat surface to do that on a large scale. Yeah, and then Godefroy, the private company, was taken over partly and bailed out by the German government in the late 19th century, and then renamed into this German trading company of the South Seas, and was very profitable. They issued dividends of over 10% each year. So if you had shares, that's pretty good for colonial kind of business companies. They were quite up there and funded lots of sort of wealth of the Hamburg shareholders and people involved in the company. Very chummy also with the colonial administration to make that happen. So partly what I trace is also the connection between state and capital in Samoa. Happy to chat more, Ulrike.
Thank you, Holger.
Yeah, sorry, so you're right.
John.
Sorry, I'm really trying to ask you this question, but I had questions about this and kind of like different kind of things that may have happened or may not have happened.
Right.
So like it's kind of a series of questions, but like I wondered like to what degree, well, are there Western settlers in these places, or is it more just like sojourners who stay for a short period of time? Or to what degree was there like elements of like segregation that were really important, like division, the physical division of peoples of different races, either in the US context or the German context or relative to one another. But also, and then like Chinese elements as well, like how that worked in, like are these Asians in racial classifications, are they not, are they something else, like that sort of thing. And then I wonder about, as far as the Samoans themselves, like how did they, right, like what notions of belonging did they have? Or were there actually displaced people ultimately? I mean, you only have 30 years there,
Right.
How did those people displaced themselves, right? If there was, say, like a half white American, half Samoan, right? How did they perceive themselves, how did they operate in these kind of hospitals, especially if there was severe segregation and so on and so forth. And I also, sorry, like, I wondered about this element of like Polynesian kind of networks and mobility and that sort of thing that had any relationship with some of the questions I'm asking, like national alliance and Samoa, of like what other regions may have been that could really complicate kind of like, you know, kind of racialization during a period of time where that face in scientific reasons. So,
Right. Okay, I'll try to keep that brief. Lots of stuff. So German Samoa is a smaller settler colony. There are settlers there. And the smaller settlers that are not connected to this big German company I just talked about, they are in need of workers because this German trade company also has kind of a monopoly of recruiting workers from its kind of trade routes, Melanesia. So they are pushing for Chinese workers, as you know, many other plantation owners do at the time. And there's conflict with the German administration because that sort of unsettles the you know, paternalistic compact between the colonial administration and sort of Samoan elites. Much more on that. Segregation happens too. I'm sort of pushing for, I'm looking at the episodes where, you know, Samoans and other workers transcend those boundaries. So there are kind of spatial boundaries on the plantations. Many of the contract workers are not allowed to leave the plantations, but they sneak away anyway. They steal themselves away. And they lay the foundation for various interracial communities in Samoa, a Sino-Samoan community, Chinese and Samoans, and then various other Pacific islands also, from Kiribati, from Vanuatu and other places. And they're still around today, some of them quite powerful even, including also the German sort of Samoan intermarriages and their descendants. Probably the most famous is Olaf Nelson, whose dad was a Swedish mariner and who married a Samoan woman, and he would become the leader of this anti-colonial Mao movement. He was one of the richest Samoans, kind of a businessman in between the worlds, spoke Samoan, you know, had a title, but also spoke English and traveled the world. He would actually go to Geneva to make the case in front of the League of Nations for Samoan self-determination. And there's a book on him actually that you could look at. And then Polynesian links, yeah, they continue, of course, throughout the period, but they are interrupted because of these empires, you know, imposing restrictions on travel. This Polynesian Confederacy in the 1880s is actually quite interesting. They had ships and tried to sort of pool resources as other Native American confederacies did, you know, in North America and other places in the world. I'll have to probably leave it at that. Happy to chat more. Well, thanks so much for coming out and happy to chat more. And Paige, do you have some final bye-bye words?
Sure. Thank you so much, Holger, for the presentation. Thank you, everybody, for coming in person and on Zoom. If you're interested in the recording, you can send me an email. And please help yourself to some snacks on your way out. Take some cookies and drinks to go. And again, the book is for sale outside.
Thank you so much for coming.